السلام علیکم، کیسے ہیں آپ سب لوگ؟ امید کرتی ہوں آپ سب لوگ بالکل خیر خیریت سے ہوں گے، اور میں بھی اللہ تعالیٰ کے فضل و کرم سے بالکل ٹھیک ٹھاک اور بالکل خیریت سے ہوں۔ امید کرتی ہوں کہ میری تمام پچھلی ویڈیوز آپ لوگوں کو سمجھ آ گئی ہوں گی، آپ کی انڈرسٹینڈنگ ان کے ساتھ بہت اچھی طریقے سے ہو گئی ہوگی۔ امید کرتی ہوں یہ ایم اے انگلش لٹریچر کا جو ایک سفر ہے آپ لوگوں کے ساتھ وہ بہت ہی زیادہ اچھا جا رہا ہوگا انشاءاللہ۔ کوشش کروں گی کہ آئندہ آنے والی تمام ویڈیوز میں اپنے آپ کو مزید امپروو کر سکوں اور آپ کے سامنے مزید بہتر سے بہتر ویڈیوز ایسی لے کے آؤں گی تاکہ آپ کو اپنی پریپریشن کے وقت، اپنے سبجیکٹس کی پریپریشن کے وقت لٹریچر کو سمجھتے ہوئے کوئی بھی کسی قسم کی کوئی پریشانی نہ ہو، ریڈنگ کرتے ہوئے یا اس طرح کی ان کے جو ورڈز ہیں ان کی پروننسیشن میں، ان کی ووکیبلری میں آپ لوگوں کو کوئی دقت نہ ہو۔ امید کرتی ہوں آئندہ آنے والی تمام ویڈیوز آپ لوگوں کو مزید امپرومنٹ کے ساتھ انشاءاللہ ضرور ملے گی۔ اس سے پہلے کہ میں اپنا یہ جو ریڈنگ جو میں نے اپنا لٹریچر کے ٹاپک پر سٹارٹ کی ہوئی ہے، جو کہ میرا انگلش لٹریچر کا ٹاپک ہے، اور اس میں مختلف جو میرا ٹارگٹ ہے وہ مختلف ناول، ان کے جو ناولسٹ ہیں، جو رائٹرز ہیں، ٹھیک ہے، ان سب کے بیک گراؤنڈ، ان ناولز کے بارے میں، اور وہ جو تمام ڈیٹیل ہے وہ میں آپ لوگوں تک سٹیپ بائی سٹیپ جو ہے وہ ضرور انفارمیٹیو طریقے سے میں ضرور آپ تک پہنچا سکوں۔ لیکن اس سے پہلے کہ میں اپنا یہ جو آج کی ویڈیو اس کو میں سٹارٹ کروں، میں آپ لوگوں سے ریکویسٹ کرتی ہوں، تمام لوگوں سے، کہ میرا چینل ضرور سبسکرائب کریں، اور جو اگر آپ لوگوں کو کچھ کہنا ہے یا کچھ کامنٹ کرنا ہے تو آپ مجھے جو ہے وہ ضرور بلا جھجک وداؤٹ اینی ہیزیٹیشن آپ مجھے ضرور کمنٹ کر سکتے ہیں۔ اس کے علاوہ لائک کا بٹن بھی پریس کر سکتے ہیں اگر آپ مجھے موٹیویٹ کرنا چاہتے ہیں، اور اگر آپ لوگ یہ دیکھتے ہیں کہ میری ویڈیوز آپ لوگوں کے لیے واقعی ہیلپ فل ہیں اور ایک بہت ہی زیادہ ہیلپ فل میٹیریل ہے، اور آپ لوگوں کی پریپریشن اس سے اچھی ہو رہی ہے، تو آپ لوگ ضرور جو ہے وہ مجھے جو ہے وہ کیا کہتے ہیں میری ویڈیوز کو لائک کر سکتے ہیں، کیونکہ آپ لوگوں کے لائک کرنے سے اور سبسکرائب کرنے سے ہی میرا چینل جو ہے وہ آگے بڑھے گا، اور اس کے علاوہ مزید یہ کہ آپ لوگوں کی موٹیویشن سے ہی میں جو ہے نا مزید امپروو ہو پاؤں گی اور مزید بہتر سے بہتر میٹیریل آپ لوگوں تک پہنچا پاؤں گی۔ تو چلیں اللہ تعالیٰ کے حکم سے اور اللہ تعالیٰ کے جو ہے وہ فضل سے، اور انشاءاللہ آج کا جو ہے وہ نیا جو ہمارا جو ٹاپک ہے، جو کہ A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man، جو ہم ناول پڑھ رہے تھے، جو ریڈ کر رہے تھے، جس کی آڈیو ہم سن رہے تھے، ٹھیک ہے، ہم آج اس کا نیا جو ہے وہ ٹاپک سٹارٹ کرتے ہیں، جو کہ اس کے بیک گراؤنڈ سے ریلیٹڈ ہے۔ تو بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم۔ فرسٹ آف آل وی وڈ اسٹارٹ فرام اٹس انٹروڈکشن۔ A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man belongs to the category of fiction called the consular roman, that is to say, novel dealing with the life of an artist. Some other well-known works of this type are the fictionalized autobiography of the Marcel Proust, which has been described as a novel that was written to explain why it was written. The Diary of Andre Gide is another such work. This has been described by Harry Lemon as the diary of a novelist who is writing a novel about a novelist who is keeping a diary about the novel he is writing. He adds, of course, the consul roman has no logic limit, but like the label on the box of Quaker Oats, it has a vanishing point. Already it is beginning to look as old-fashioned as Murger's White de Bohème, although in this type of novel, the normal procedure of applying the methods of art to the subject of reality is reversed. It is the only type of novel which can include the portrait within its scope. In 1913, D.H. Lawrence had published his portrait of himself as artist. Sons and Lovers, both books convey the claustral sense of a young intelligence, swells in convention and constricted by poverty, and the intensity of its first response to aesthetic experiences and life at large. To the extent to which Lawrence warms to his theme is the measure of Joyce's reserve. Characteristically, and they may be reacting from the very different institutions behind them, evangelical English Protestantism and Irish Catholic orthodoxy. When Lawrence dwells on the attraction of life and Joyce's on its repulsion, the respective mothers of the two artists play a similar role, yet May Deadlas is a wraith besides the full-bodied realization of Mrs. Morel. The characters in Sons and Lovers seem to enjoy an independent existence in the portrait. They figure mainly in the hero's rivalries and resentments. Joyce's treatment of childhood is unrelieved in its sadness. Endless generation of choirs of children sounded for Stephen Dedalus, the same note of pain and weariness that new man had heard in Virgil. All seemed weary of life even before entering upon it. Long gestation. Elizabeth Drew points attention to the fact that the completion of the portrait consumed one whole decade. At the end of the portrait, Joyce dated the book, Dublin 1904, Trustee 1914. It was the result, therefore, of 10 years gestation and creation before it satisfied him that it was completed in finally form. Richard Ellman tells us in his biography of Joyce that he wrote the first sketch for it when he was 21, then extended it under the title Stephen Hero to over 1,000 pages. This was completed in 1907, and immediately Joyce decided to scrap the whole thing and recast and concentrate it into a third of its length with its present title. Joyce and his unusual troubles over publication, and when it finally appeared in America in 1916 and in England the following years, its reception was very mixed. One reviewer called it a study in garbage, another a brilliant and nasty variety of pseudo realism, but it was also hailed as one of the most remarkable confessions outside Russian and French literature. Ezra Pound said that it contained the best prose of the decade and was one of the few works that showed creative inventions, while the English magazine The Nation called Joyce a new writer with a new form. The portrait and Stephen Hero. The change from Stephen Hero to the finished portrait highlights many significant aspects of Joyce's art. The portrait usured in a new form of writing. Joyce himself had characterized this new form in his description of his original sketch. He pointed out that the past has no iron memorial aspect but implies a fluid succession of presents. What we are to look for is not a fixed character but an individual rhythm. In its final design, however, he changed the whole focus of this rhythm. The change in title points to a change in perspective. From the fragments of Stephen Hero that survives, we see that the development centered in the individuality of the protagonist as a man. In the portrait, the accent falls on the artist. The material is similarly slanted. In the early version, the treatment of Stephen in his unhappy relations with family, church, and society is much fuller and more direct and illustrated with much more narrative action. In the portrait, the Dublin environment is not attacked so much frontally as wrecking the individual. It is revealed as a deadly enemy that threatens the free development of the artist and undermines the primary need of the artist to be loyal to his calling. Stephen and Joyce. We must not read the book as straight autobiography. Some critics indeed argue that Stephen Douglas is not James Joyce at all. While that seems most improbable, nevertheless, the book is a work of art, not a slice of life, and the materials of the life it creates have been selected, arranged, altered, dramatized, and fictionalized to support the central theme. They are probably all true to the spirits of Joyce's development, but not necessary to the fact. The result is an evocation of the growing conscience and consciousness of a dedicated writer and of the wrapping and uncongenial environment that surrounds him. The story of how a gifted, imaginative, and intellectual misfit frees himself from the shackling influence of family, church, and society and sets out as an exile to fulfill the vocation. Isolation, Joyce's sense of isolation was the cause why his why his novel was written. Stephen has been a spiritual exile from his social surroundings since early childhood. The description of him in the football game at Longos might be metaphor of all his participation in the life of his fellow. He crept about from point to point on the fringe of his line, making little runs now and then. When he is at Belvedere College, he champions Byron and Shelley and Ibsen, feels in his schoolmates a vague journal malignant joy. When he is accused of heresy in an essay and sees himself proud and sensitive and suspicious, battling against the squalor of his life and the riot of his mind. At the university, the student's district is intellectual crankery. He feels equally isolated from the church and knows that he could never train for the priesthood. His destiny was to be elusive of social and religious orders. He was destined to learn how own wisdom apart from others or to learn the wisdom of others, himself wandering among the snares of the world. In his own family, he is equally apart. He realizes it when he has spent his prize money on trying to restore some order and elegance into the home. We are told we saw clearly his own futile isolation. He had not gone one step nearer the lives he had sought to approach. He felt that he was hardly of one blood with them, but stood to them rather in the mystical kingship of foster child and foster brother. Again, in his phase of religious devotion, he finds it impossible to combine his pious practices with any human charity towards others. To merge his life in the common tide of other lives was harder for him than any fasting or praying. Perpetual exile. Stephen, like Joyce, feels exiled when in his own country, Ireland. In spite of little runs now and then, he remains always on the fringe of any corporate life and an exile within his own country. To fulfill himself, he must leave Ireland, and he tells his friend Damon why. Damon urges him to be one of us, tells his that is a dedicated Irishman. Stephen replies bitterly that Ireland has always rewarded devotion to her curse by betrayal. She is the old soul who eats her farrow. And he continues, when the soul of man is born in his country, there are nuts flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk to me of nationality, language, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets. The book is the story of the nets and the escape from them to freedom, and the name of the hero is full of symbolic significance. Stephen is the name of the first Christian martyr. He protested that God's message to the people had been misinterpreted. Which of the prophets have your fathers not persecuted? But the synagogue said he spoke blasphemy and that they cast him out of the city and stoned him. That Joyce meant that this analogy to be drawn in is clear when he makes Stephen think of S.T. Stephen's Green in Dublin as his Green. Indeed, the later treatment of Joyce by Dublin over the publication of Dubliners and in the banning of his later books has borne out the parallel. But the surname Daedalus is far more important, since the symbolism surrounding that encloses the whole story from start to finish. It has a double significance for Joyce. The mythical Daedalus was imprisoned in a labyrinth on an island of Crete and escaped by inventing wings. He is a symbol, therefore, not only of the rebel who breaks out of his prison, but of the inventor who creates the instrument of his escape. He is both man and artist. Etymologically, the names mean the cunning one, and the epigraph of the book is a line from Ovid Metamorphoses, who tells of Daedalus making his plans and he gave up his mind to obscure arts, religious background, sermon on hell. Since Joyce appears to have based his Hellfire sermons so closely on the 17th century Jesuit fathers' meditations, there is some room for interpreting a portrait of the artist as a young man as having a religious significance. In the first place, there is no scandal of plagiarism involved. Pinamonti's pamphlet is not copyright material. It is one version of a long series of rewriting of the same material, and Joseph Way will not only be excused for adding still another version without acknowledging his sources, but even he congratulated for having written the definitive ultimate form. In fact, Elizabeth F. Boyd is of the view that Joyce wanted his plagiarism to be noticed and attended to. In the second place, Joyce did not notice and did not care a rap about technical plagiarism and probably would have welcomed identification of his source. Surely he would have expected someone to notice that he was relaying a 17th century text, especially since those little tracts had been so frequently reprinted in all the languages of Europe. He probably wanted his borrowing to be recognized, for it is a kind of silent comment on the unyielding traditions of the type of Catholicism he grew up with, towards which he maintained all his life the ambivalent attitude of admiration and rejection. Catholic tradition. The third chapter of the portrait is the story of young Stephen Douglas' encounter with the full force of that Catholic tradition. It helps the emotional intensity and the logic of the story that the church should present hellfire on in this classic form. It is not some modern lukewarm parochial parochial version that Stephen must face, but the great tradition of the church in full armor at greatest intensity. This is what Stephen, the martyr of heretical faith, and at last the crafty artist, must defeat with his own cunning and integrity, his evasion and defiance are made much more dramatic by enhancing the power of tradition he is challenging. Depiction of Irish Jesuit. The whole novel is molding of actualities into the form of art, and the Irish Jesuits are also to be represented here faithfully but idealized in art by a transcript from their own traditional writings. In the surviving fragments of Stephen Hero, Stephen Crisis, can we not root this pest out of our mind and out of our society, that man may be able to walk through the streets without meeting some old stale belief or hypocrisy at every street corner? I at least will try. The retreat chapter in the portrait constitutes an effective attack by Joyce, all the more so because he denies himself any ostentatious caricatures, sneering or facetiousness, maintaining instead a dignified solemnity which is in keeping with Stephen's honest experience, and above all, using an actual Jesuit document. This makes the depiction of the religion atmosphere in the novel all the more authentic. A portrait of the artist as a young man, historical and literary context. Joyce's Ireland, the historical and political context. A portrait of the artist as a young man is set in Ireland in the late 19th century and at the very beginning of the 20th century. Joyce does not give precise dates in the narrative, but there is a reference to at least one historical event, the fall of Parnell, that helps to date the action. Moreover, critics agree that the incidents in the life of Stephen Dedalus, the young man of the title, closely parallel incidents in the life of Joyce himself. In 1904, Joyce wrote an autobiographical essay titled A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Joyce was born in 1882 and graduated from University College Dublin in 1902. These years approximately from the parameters of the novel. Joyce grew up in an Ireland that constitutionally was a part of a nation formerly known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, located just to the west of Great Britain. Ireland had its own distinctive customs and cultures. Most significantly, while Protestantism was the predominant religion in Great Britain, most native Irish people were Roman Catholics. However, both politically and economically, Ireland had long been dominated by Britain. This dominant British presence in Ireland went back to the Middle Ages, when Norman knights from England first arrived in Ireland at the invitation of local Irish chieftains. The British presence in Ireland grew over the next few hundred years for a variety of reasons. During the reign in England of Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, British settlers, mainly from Scotland, went to Ireland and suppressed a local Irish resistance in the mid 1600s. British rule of Ireland was further consolidated by the English parliamentary leader Oliver Cromwell, whose armies scoured the Irish countryside. Cromwell drove many thousands of native Irish from their land and persecuted Irish Catholics. The Roman Catholic Church was outlawed in 1695, but Catholic priests continued to practice underground. Periodically, Irish factions rebelled against British rule, but these rebellions, notably one in 1798, were easily put down. Ironically, many of the leaders of this Irish nationalist movement were Irish Protestants who were descended from earlier British settlers. In 1800, the Irish Parliament in Dublin was dissolved, and the two countries were joined under a single government headquarters in London. Nevertheless, despite British persecution of the native Irish, a distinctive Irish identity remained strong. By the late 19th century, many Irish people aspired to a form of limited Irish independence known as Home Rule. The Great Famine of the 1840s saw the death or emigration of some several million Irish men, women, and children, more than half the total population of Ireland at the time. However, this period proved a turning point in the Irish struggle for self determination. In 1879, a Catholic nationalist named Michael David formed the Irish National Land League, which agitated for rights for the Irish Catholic tenants for Protestant owned land. David is mentioned in a portrait of the artist as a young man, along with Charles Stewart Parnell. The action of a portrait occurs some time after the activities of David and the downfall of Parnell. However, in the novel, the memory of Parnell is still strong. Joyce, an individualist, was disturbed both by Ireland's nationalist politics and the strict doctrine of the Catholic Church. He regarded himself as a cosmopolitan, a citizen of Europe, if not of the world. This is made very clear in the final chapter of a portrait, in which Stephen Dedalus declares his intention to fly past the nets of nationality, religion, language. Nonetheless, like Stephen himself, Joyce was very much shaped by the history and religion of his country. Ironically, the Irish nationalist uprising that eventually led to Irish independence occurred in 1916, the very year in which a portrait was published in England. By this time, Joyce was living in Zurich. Joyce's Ireland, the literary context. By the time Joyce made his mark as a writer, Ireland already had a long and distinguished literary history. During the so called Dark Ages, Irish monks helped preserve classical learning, copying classical texts in beautiful manuscripts. Poets were greatly esteemed and held high position in the courts of Irish kings. During the long period of British domination, some of the finest art writers in the English language were Anglo-Irish, that is, Irish of British descent. Among these were the poet and satirist Jonathan Swift (1667 to 1745), who served as dean of St. Patrick Cathedral in Dublin; the poet and prose writers Oliver Goldsmith (1730 to 1774), the statesman and political philosopher Edmund Burke (1729 to 1797), the lyricist Thomas Moore (1779 to 1852), the novelist Maria Edgeworth (1768 to 1849), and the comic writers Somerville and Rose, pen name of Edith Somerville (1858 to 1949), and Violet Martin (1862 to 1915), whose stories chronicled the Catholic activities of Anglo-Irish landlords and their servants and tenants in the big houses of rural Ireland. By the mid 1800s, however, sentimental stories and ballads of no great literary merit were the norm. At the late 1800s and early 1900s, the time frame during which a portrait is set, saw a movement known as the Irish Literary Revival. Leading writing in this movement were Douglas Hyde (1860 to 1949), founder of the Gaelic League; Lady Augustus Gregory (1852 to 1932), and the playwright John Millington Shershank (1871 to 1909). Unquestionably, the central figures in which group was the poet and the dramatist William Butler Yeats in 1867 to 1939. Almost single-handedly, Yeats created a new Irish literature. By the time Joyce was an undergraduate student at University College Dublin, Yeats was the most famous living Irish writers. However, the work of Yeats and his association made much use of Irish themes and subjects drawn from Irish folklore and mythology. Joyce, on the other hand, had discovered the work of French writers and of Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen. Stephen Dedalus, statesman, in chapter 5 of a portrait, suggests that Joyce had already decided to reject the celebration of Irish nationalism as a literary theme. When the young Joyce was introduced to Yeats, he told Yeats that the poet was already too old to help him. Rather than write about ancient heroes and legends. Joyce wanted to chronicle the lives of ordinary people in his early fiction. There is another notable difference between Joyce and his best known predecessor. At a time when Protestants dominated the cultural institutions of Ireland, Joyce was the first major Irish Catholic church, even though he himself rejected Roman Catholicism, a process that is detailed in a portrait of the artist. As a young man, he made his religious background an integral aspect of this novel. And although he wrote brilliantly in the English language, Joyce was keenly aware that he wrote in the language of Ireland conquerors. Thank you so much for bearing me uh, up to the end. होप सो यू लाइक माई वीडियो। आप सब लोगों से वीडियो के ख़त्म पे एट द एंड मैं रिक्वेस्ट करना चाहती हूँ कि मेरे चैनल को ज़रूर सब्सक्राइब करें और मेरी वीडियोस को ज़रूर प्रमोट करें, उनको लाइक करें। ये तमाम वीडियोस जो मैं बना रही हूँ इस टाइम पे स्टेप बाय स्टेप, ये सारी तमाम वीडियोस सिर्फ एक हेल्पिंग मटेरियल हैं कि हम अपने तमाम जो जितने भी पेपर्स हैं, जो भी लिटरेचर की अंडरस्टैंडिंग है, उसमें हम लोग अपना जो भी हम हिस्सा डाल सकते हैं, जो पार्ट कर सकते हैं, वो पार्ट उसको ज़रूर फुलफ़िल करें। तो इसी दुआ के साथ कि आप सब लोग खुश रहें और हमारे जो जितने भी मतलब इस तमाम यूनिवर्स में जितने भी लोग एग्जिस्ट कर रहे हैं इस टाइम पे, वो तमाम लोग खुशी से और हंसी से तमाम लोग जो है वो क्या कहते हैं अपनी ज़िंदगियाँ वो खुशी से गुजार सके। और जितने भी लोगों के जो मसाइल अल्लाह पाक सबकी जो है ना आसानियाँ करें, आप सबकी ज़िंदगियों में आसानियाँ पैदा हो और मेरे लिए भी बहुत ज़्यादा दुआ करें। इसी दुआ के साथ मैं आज की वीडियो का इख्तिताम करती हूँ और मिलते हैं हम नेक्स्ट आने वाली न्यू वीडियो के साथ जो कि इसी नावल से रिलेटेड होगी इंशाल्लाह। तब तक के लिए मुझे अपनी दुआओं में याद रखिएगा और मेरे चैनल को सब्सक्राइब करना ना भूलिएगा। तब तक के लिए अल्लाह हाफ़िज़, टेक केयर, stay blessed.